I am so excited to be here. I'm like on my little tippy toes if I wasn't sitting. And I wanted to say thank you, especially to Carrie, for putting this all together. I've watched her over the last several weeks and months just allow God to birth the idea in her heart and mind. And she's done so much work. So she's really the heart and soul of this whole thing. So thank you, Carrie. So today, I would love to talk with you a bit about, we've talked about lots of things to refocus on. Today, I'd like to talk about refocusing on Jesus, which is pretty much implied in all the things we've talked about, but let's focus on that in particular. And even more specifically, we're going to talk about how do you move from everyday anxiety to everyday apprenticeship with Jesus, and do those even go together? Because I think in our culture these days, maybe we act like they don't. Maybe like when things are better, I'll go deeper with God, but right now I'm just getting through it. I'm just getting by. So we're going to talk about how you merge those two together and how they really work best in tandem. So let's just break it down into the parts. First of all, let's talk about some anxiety. I mean, good grief. If there's ever been a time to be anxious, or at least to be tempted to be anxious, it's now. It's unprecedented, all that's going on. We've had all sorts of things, the coronavirus pandemic, we've had economic shutdown, we've had horrible tragedy of George Floyd's death and the outcry that has arisen from that. We've had protests and riots. Now we're back to protests. Who knows? But God, what's coming next? And so if you are the least bit prone to anxiety, or even if you're not, this is a time where all of us are feeling just a teensy bit anxious. So there's no shame in that. We're just going to talk about, what do you do when you have this big pile of anxiety in your heart? What do you do? Also, I want to talk a bit about what is apprenticeship. How many of you have ever been an apprentice or used that word in daily conversation, unless you were watching, the TV show, The Apprentice? So I want to explain a working definition of what does apprentice even mean, or apprenticeship. Well, imagine that you knew somebody who was really good at the very thing you wanted to be really good at. And you asked them if they would let you apprentice under them. So you would basically follow them around, hang out with them, work with them, maybe even work for them, often for free. You would just pay attention to everything they do and observe, how do they do life? And especially, how do they do life in their area of expertise? So just have that kind of back in the back of your mind when we talk about apprentice. Now, there are words, disciple, mentee, there's all sorts of words, student, but I'm choosing to talk about the word apprentice because it's a very, very intentional word. You don't stumble into apprenticeship. You don't go, oh my gosh, I woke up on a Thursday and I was an apprentice. No, you choose it. And so, as I said, we don't tend to notice or think that anxiety and Jesus apprenticeship go together. In our Western world especially, I've noticed that we tend to often say, well, like now, maybe your kids are home, maybe your husband's home, maybe your wife is home, and you're going, I have not got any free time to myself. I don't have time for my usual devotions. So I guess I have to go deep with Jesus some other time. I guess, I'm just going to get through this, and when things are better, I'll go deeper with Jesus. But actually in the Bible, the early church had the exact opposite response. They're like, things are awful. They're killing Christians. Horrible things are happening. I better go deep with Jesus now to get through it. So I just want to kind of help shift that paradigm in your mind. It's not something you're going to do later when things are better. It just might have to look different. It might not be an hour with your cup of coffee reading your Bible. It might be while you're doing your housework, you're listening to the Bible audio, or maybe while you're doing the dishes, you decide this is going to be my Jesus deep breath prayer time, and I'm going to go, oh Lord, you've got this, and I choose to surrender to you. Whatever it is, it may look different. So they work best in tandem. They don't work as well separately. Now, lately, I've been doing some reading about brain research in the area of anxiety because I have been experiencing, like you all, a lot of anxiety. In fact, I suffer from OCD, which a lot of people know, and for the last 30 years, it's been pretty mild. But when the pandemic hit, everything you're not supposed to do if you have OCD was suddenly what you're supposed to do. Wash your hands all the time, use hand sanitizer, think about germs constantly, and it really sent me over the edge. And to the point that for the first time in my life, I've had to go on medication and have OCD therapy. And it was very, very humbling because I really thought, well, the Lord's got this. I understand how this works. And when you turned up the heat, it was different. So I've been reading a lot of brain research on how does your brain work on anxiety. And what I discovered is that when you feel threatened, when you feel your safety is threatened, your standing in the community or your respect level from somebody or a relationship, when you feel those things are threatened, guess what happens? The smart part of your brain shuts down. It just goes, I'm out of here. And it turns everything over to the fight, flight, or freeze part of your brain. So in other words, when you're anxious, it is not a teachable moment. Not at all. So then the question is, well, then how do you ever have a teachable moment with Jesus if you're anxious? We're going to talk about what's the on-ramp. How do you shift gears so that you can have a teachable moment? I have a little prop. It's kind of fun and romper room silly, but I hope it will help you to understand this a little better. So this is what I call my Nerf Earth. I really call it that. And I use it. I have it next to my desk. I use it to remind myself in moments of anxiety that, oh, that's right. He has the whole world in his hands. It may feel a little weird, but he's got it in his hands. And so I'm going to show you the process of how you go from anxiety to a teachable moment with this little Nerf Earth. So when we're anxious, we tend to tense up a little bit. I don't know about you, but my muscles, my stomach tenses up. And so we begin to hang on to whatever it is we think we might be able to control. And then often we're so anxious about the bigger things that we're hanging on to things that we couldn't possibly control, like how the coronavirus is going to end and what's going to happen to our children and all these different things. And then we start doing really counterproductive things like overeating and stressing out, all these different things till the earth, the world around us looks like this distorted, monstrous, unsolvable puzzle. And it feels like there's nothing we can do. It freezes us in place. But when we refocus on Jesus, guess what happens? We go, Lord, I'm sorry, I forgot. You've got this. You have a plan. I don't know what it is sometimes, but you are working with humanity. You have a plan. You're striving with mankind. You are letting this all unfold, and you have a plan. What happens? You start to relax. And when you relax, guess what happens? The earth and the world and your life comes a little bit more back into focus. Now, it's still messed up. There's still problems. There's still all kinds of craziness. But inside of you, there's focus again. Then you realize who's in charge and who's got you. Now, that's the process we're going to talk about in real practical ways. How do you make that transition? So we're going to retire the Nerf Earth, but I tell you where to get them, but I don't know. So let's just talk about some examples of suggestions. How could you do that? So we talked about a couple, like for example, if you don't have time for your usual quiet time, maybe you need to build a different habit in this season. Or oftentimes when you ask the Lord, Lord, what have you got for me? What can I actually do? Because have you ever noticed that when you're anxious, you usually stress out about a million things you can't do a thing about, and that freezes you. And guess what happens to the things you can do something about? The things that are actually your responsibility? I don't know about you, but my closet becomes a mess. Laundry falls by the wayside. I don't do as much housekeeping, whatever. For you, it might be something different, but I don't do the things that I know to do. So once you've had that moment with Jesus, you can say, Lord, what's the lesson in this? Or dare I say it, what's the blessing? For me, having OCD, for 6 weeks, it froze me completely in place. I couldn't function. I mean, I could eat and sleep, and my husband did everything else because I couldn't function. That part of my brain that has OCD went, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, and that's all I could do. But once you're able to finally look up and say, Lord, what's the lesson? You also see, there was a blessing even in my OCD, because for 20 years, 30 years, it was kind of a low grade 2 or 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, symptom-wise. It was kind of like I had my brakes dragging, but it wasn't too bad. I didn't need to take the car in or anything. Then when all of this hit, I was incapacitated. So I had to do something different. I had to consider medication for the first time. I had to consider, I wonder if there's such a thing as OCD therapy for the first time. And I feel like the Lord is revealing to me, you don't have to have your brakes dragging. You can learn how to get that 2 or 3 down to a 0 or a 1 in just learning some different ways to let the rest of your brain compensate for the OCD. So there may be a blessing. Maybe your kids are home and they're driving you up a wall. But guess what? You have kids. Do you know there are people who don't, who would be privileged to be driven up that wall? Still they would be driven, but still, it's a blessing. It's a privilege. So also I want to point out a couple of, how are we doing on time, Carrie? Can you give me a hint? How much time I got left? That would help me. Okay, so I also want to give you a couple of categories of things. Now, Jesus is going to tell you what the lesson is or what the blessing is. He'll reveal that to you if you listen. But I want to give you a couple of ideas of categories of things he might ask you to do. Because you ever noticed he was going to heal a guy and he's like, extend your hand. He said, extend your hand to a man whose hand was withered. Come on. I mean, the guy could have said, I can't do that. And he would still have a withered hand, but he made the effort. And I think Jesus often does that with us and says, okay, will you just do this to show that we're in this together, that your heart's in it? He might ask you to do a couple of things. There are stopping doing things kind of spiritual muscles, and there are doing things kind of spiritual muscles. So for example, something you might need to stop doing is completely pigging out on junk food during the coronavirus. So that's a not doing muscle that the Lord might ask you, okay, next time you go to the store, don't buy every sweet and salty thing you can imagine. Once you're done with these things, don't buy more. That's a not doing muscle. Or similarly, he might have you do a doing muscle. Maybe you're not remotely doing your fitness program anymore. You might say, okay, I just want you to practice a doing muscle. And the cool thing is when you practice a doing muscle or a not doing muscle, it doesn't just affect that one area. I once heard John Ortberg, who's an author and speaker and pastor, he said he noticed that when he practiced a not doing muscle in fasting, it helped him to have more sexual purity, which is also a not doing muscle in his mind, in his thoughts. And so, it translates from one area to the next. So it might be a habit he asks you to start. It might be a not doing muscle, a doing muscle, or just sometimes he asks me to do nothing, to just sit there and be and meditate on the fact that my brain's going crazy, but he has got this. So whatever it is for you, I think it kind of boils down to, you're not God. I'm not God. And I think when we're anxious, we don't realize it until later, but sometimes, okay, I'll just say me. I'll realize after the fact, I was kind of trying to do God's job for him because I didn't think he was quite doing it right. Like I'm going to be extra cautious so I don't get the coronavirus and nobody I know does. You can follow the CDC guidelines, but you cannot prevent everything that God in his sovereignty may or may not allow. So you're not God. And I think sometimes we just need a healthy dose of not God now. No, still not God. No matter what's going on, I'm not God. One of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes, actually I don't have any unfavorite C.S. Lewis quotes, but one of my very favorites is, and I'm going to paraphrase because it's long, but is that by the end of our lives, each of us is going to have one of two conversations with God. We're either going to, at some point, say to God, thy will be done. Or we're going to decide we don't want to do that. And we don't have to. And then at some point, God is going to say to us, thy will be done. Okay, you don't want me? You don't have to have me. That's a pretty scary thought. But I pray today that you will choose the first, that you will choose to surrender to the Lord in your anxiety and let him give you a lesson or a gift instead. It's not the end of the world to feel anxious. It's actually kind of an on-ramp to being an apprentice of Jesus. So one quick disclaimer, if like me, you know that you have an actual anxiety disorder or you suspect, I encourage you, all these principles totally apply, but also you may need medical help. You might need to take some medication, or you might need a spotter and a counselor or someone like that. So don't go it alone. These principles hold true, but you might need a help getting to the on-ramp, an on-ramp to the on-ramp. So I encourage you, don't go it alone. And my worksheet, which walks you through these steps, is on the unit button. So God bless you. So happy to be with you today.